The blood pooled beneath the cabin door, seeping through gaps in the floorboards like syrup through a sieve. 3 axes lay scattered across the porch, their handles slick with evidence of what 18-year-old triplets could accomplish when pushed beyond human endurance. This is the story of Clara, Carrie, and Cora McKinnon, sisters born on the same August night in 1904, who would die on the same October night 22 years later, but not before ensuring that Boone Hollow would never echo with men's voices again. The mountain fog clung to the Tennessee ridges that October morning in 1926, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something metallic that the wind couldn't wash away. Deep in Boone Hollow, where civilization thinned to nothing but rutted paths and rotting cabins, the McKinnon homestead sat silent for the first time in decades. No cursing, no bottles breaking against walls, no sounds of fists meeting flesh. The sisters had been planning this night for 3 months, ever since Uncle Ezra had done things to Cora that left her bleeding for a week. They'd whispered their intentions in the root cellar while shelling beans, in the smokehouse while hanging meat, in the outhouse where privacy was measured in seconds stolen between beatings. Clara, born first by 7 minutes, had always been the strategist. Her left eye never opened fully after their father Silas had backhanded her at age 12 for spilling his moonshine. Carrie, the middle sister, spoke in whispers since Uncle Jeb had choked her unconscious for sassing him the previous spring. Cora, youngest by mere minutes but oldest in suffering, carried scars across her back that formed a map of every drunk rage the men had inflicted. From a letter found in the McKinnon cabin after the incident, Daddy says we ain't worth the food we eat, says we should thank him for keeping us alive, but alive ain't the same as living. The Hollow had been home to the McKinnon clan for 4 generations, each more isolated and violent than the last. Silas McKinnon ruled his domain with knuckles scarred from decades of beating sense into anyone who crossed him. His brothers Jeb and Ezra had settled on adjacent plots after the Great War, bringing home shell shock and a taste for corn liquor that made their tempers burn hotter than cook stove coals. The sisters had learned early that survival meant invisibility. They rose before dawn to milk the cow, tend the vegetable patch, and prepare meals that were never seasoned with gratitude. They mended clothes by candlelight, chopped firewood until their hands bled, and absorbed punishment meant for 3 men who drank away their shame instead of facing it. But 18 years of training in silence had also trained them in observation. Clara noticed that Daddy always passed out in his chair by 11:30 on Saturdays after finishing his weekly bottle of White Lightning. Carrie tracked Uncle Jeb's habit of sleeping so deep that thunder couldn't wake him once the liquor hit his bloodstream. Cora had mapped every creak in the floorboards, every squeaky door hinge, every path through the cabin that wouldn't wake a sleeping drunk. They'd tested their theory twice before, creeping through the cabin after midnight to ensure the men stayed unconscious. The first test run had been in August, when they'd moved Daddy's bottle from the kitchen table to his bedroom without him stirring. The second came in September, when they'd rearranged the entire parlor furniture while all 3 men snored through their stupor. The axes came from the woodshed behind Uncle Ezra's cabin. 3 identical tools their grandfather had forged in 1898, worn smooth by decades of splitting oak and hickory. Clara had sharpened all 3 blades the week before, testing each edge against newspaper until it sliced clean through without tearing. On the night of October 15th, the sisters served supper as they always did. Cornbread and beans, salt pork and gravy, mason jars filled with moonshine that burned like liquid fire. They stood in the kitchen doorway, hands folded, watching their tormentors eat and drink and laugh about which sister they'd teach lessons to after dessert. The men never noticed how the sisters watched them, never saw the communication that passed between identical faces in glances that lasted half a heartbeat, never suspected that 18 years of shared misery had created a bond stronger than blood, deeper than fear. 10:47 p.m. Uncle Jeb's head hit the table first, knocked unconscious by his own gluttony. Ezra followed at 11:15, sliding from his chair to the floor with a thud that shook dust from the rafters. Silas McKinnon, the patriarch of pain, lasted until 11:32 before his snores filled the cabin like death rattles. The sisters waited until midnight. They'd learned patience in a school where mistakes meant broken bones and miscalculations meant worse. When the grandfather clock in the parlor chimed 12 times, they moved with the precision of a machine designed for one purpose. Clara took the front bedroom where Daddy slept. Carrie claimed the back room where Uncle Jeb had collapsed. Cora walked to the parlor where Ezra sprawled across the sofa, his mouth open, his breathing steady as a saw cutting wood. Each sister lifted her axe above her head and brought it down with the force of 18 years of accumulated rage. The sounds that followed weren't screams or pleas for mercy, because unconscious men can't beg for what they never gave. Justice doesn't always wear a blindfold. By dawn, Boone Hollow would discover that some sins can only be washed away with blood, and that 3 young women had finally found their voices in the silence that followed their final act of rebellion. But first came the cleanup, the covering of tracks, and the decision that would seal their fate as surely as they'd sealed their tormentors. What would you do if you'd been born into that cabin, raised by those hands, broken by that system? Before we continue, I want to know where you're watching this story unfold. What time is it where you are right now? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this draw you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next would change 3 lives forever. The blood had stopped flowing, but the real story was just beginning. The rooster's crow at 5:30 a.m. shattered the silence like glass against stone. 3 sisters stood in their kitchen, hands red with more than berry juice, staring at each other across a chasm they could never cross back over. This was the moment when killers are made or broken, when the adrenaline fades and reality settles like frost on a grave. Clara wiped her hands on her apron with mechanical precision, the same motion she'd used to clean chicken blood 1,000 times before. But chicken blood washed away easier. Carrie stood frozen by the wash basin, her reflection wavering in the water like a ghost uncertain of its own existence. Cora sat heavily in Daddy's chair, the chair that would never creak under his weight again, and began to rock with the rhythm of someone counting heartbeats that had stopped. The cabin smelled of death and wood smoke, copper pennies and fear. Outside, the morning mist clung to the hollow like a shroud, muffling the sounds of a world that didn't yet know what had changed in the night. From the Carter County Sheriff's Report, October 16th, 1926. No signs of forced entry. Victims appeared to have been killed while sleeping. Excessive force used in all 3 cases. They had perhaps 6 hours before someone came looking. The McKinnon men were known for their Sunday trips to Milligan's store, where they'd trade moonshine for supplies and terrorize any woman unfortunate enough to cross their path. When they failed to appear, old Milligan would eventually send someone up the mountain to check on them. Clara, always the leader, broke the spell first. "We got to make this look right," she said, her voice steady as creek stones. "Like strangers done it. Like robbery. But what do you steal from people who own nothing but cruelty and empty bottles?" The sisters moved through their childhood home like sleepwalkers in a nightmare that had finally turned in their favor. They scattered the few coins from Daddy's tobacco tin across the floor, overturned furniture, broke the window in the back bedroom to suggest forced entry. Every detail calculated to point suspicion away from 3 young women who supposedly lacked the strength to swing an axe hard enough to split oak or skulls. Carrie found Daddy's moonshine ledger, the careful records of who owed what and when payment was due. Names of men throughout the hollow who'd rather die than have their wives discover their debts. "Burn it," Clara ordered, but Cora shook her head. "Keep it. Shows he had enemies. Plenty of reasons for someone to come calling with bad intentions." The genius of their deception lay not in what they added, but in what they erased. Every sign that the McKinnon sisters had been planning this night, every indication that they possessed the knowledge to execute such perfect violence. They hid their grandfather's whetstone, the one Clara had used to sharpen the axes, burned the rags they'd used to muffle the sounds, washed the blood from their nightgowns with lye soap strong enough to strip paint. By 7 a.m., they'd transformed from executioners back into victims. 3 orphan sisters discovered cowering in the root cellar, traumatized by the brutal murders of their only remaining family. The performance began when Ezra's wife Ruth came calling at 8:15, worried because her husband hadn't returned home the night before. Ruth McKinnon was a woman carved thin by worry and scarred by years of covering bruises with powder and lies. She climbed the porch steps calling Ezra's name, then stopped when she saw the broken window, the overturned chairs visible through the doorway. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, backing toward her wagon. That's when Clara emerged from the root cellar, dirt in her hair, tears streaming down her face, shaking like autumn leaves in a storm. "Miss Ruth," she sobbed, running to the older woman's arms. "They're all dead. Strangers came in the night, killed them all." The lie tasted like salvation. Ruth McKinnon believed every word because she'd spent 15 years praying for exactly this kind of divine intervention. She'd seen what Ezra did to his nieces, heard Silas's rages echoing through the hollow, watched 3 young women age decades and months under the weight of masculine cruelty. When Clara collapsed against her chest, Ruth held her tight and whispered, "Thank the Lord, you girls are safe." Within an hour, half the hollow had gathered at the McKinnon cabin. Men with shotguns and suspicious eyes, women with covered dishes and knowing glances, children who pressed close to their mothers, sensing something in the air that adults pretended not to understand. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at 10:37 a.m., his badge polished bright as his reputation was tarnished. Bradley had ignored complaints about the McKinnon men for years, dismissing reports of violence as family matters and mountain justice. Now he stood in their parlor, studying 3 corpses and wondering why he felt more relieved than outraged. The sisters had prepared for his questions. They sat together on the porch swing, holding hands, speaking in broken sentences about masked strangers and terrible sounds in the night. Clara described hearing glass break. Carrie whispered about men's voices, arguing over something they couldn't understand. Cora, the most damaged and therefore most believable, could only sob and rock, occasionally muttering, "So much blood," in a voice thin as spider silk. Nobody asked why 3 young women had hidden in the root cellar instead of running for help. Nobody questioned how they'd remained undiscovered while their attackers ransacked the cabin. Nobody wondered why the killers had left 3 witnesses alive when dead women tell no tales. Sometimes people don't ask questions because they don't want to hear the answers. Sheriff Bradley walked through the cabin, noting the obvious staging, the carefully planted evidence, the 2 convenient details that pointed toward robbery gone wrong. But he also noted the years of violence these walls had witnessed, the fear that had lived in this hollow like a 4th member of the family. When he looked at 3 young women weeping for the only family they'd ever known, he saw Justice, wearing an unfamiliar face. From his private notes, found after his death in 1953, sometimes the law serves justice. Sometimes justice serves itself. Either way, 3 devils got what they deserved. The investigation would be thorough, but not enthusiastic. Evidence would be collected, but not examined too closely. Witnesses would be questioned, but not pressed too hard. Because everyone in Carter County understood that some crimes solve bigger problems than they create. The sisters had bought themselves time, but time was a currency that spent quickly in places where secrets grew like weeds, and truth was whatever the community agreed to believe. Soon they would face their first real test, not from the law, but from someone who knew them well enough to see through their carefully constructed grief. What happens when the perfect crime meets the imperfect human heart? Their mother's sister, Aunt Velma, was riding up the mountain path, and she carried 20 years of memories that could unravel everything the sisters had built in a single morning. Velma McKinnon pulled her wagon to a stop outside the cabin and knew immediately that her prayers had been answered in the worst possible way. The smell of death hung in the October air, like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. But Velma had been praying for her sister's daughters for 18 years, and she recognized the hand of God even when it wore work gloves and carried an axe. Velma was the sister who'd escaped, married young to a Baptist preacher, moved to Johnson City, built a life beyond the reach of McKinnon men and their fists. She'd begged her sister Mary to leave the Hollow before the girls were born, had offered to take them in when they were children, had watched from a distance as 3 bright spirits were slowly crushed under the weight of masculine rage. Now she climbed down from her wagon with the careful movements of someone who'd spent 43 years reading violence in men's faces and lies in women's eyes. The gathered neighbors parted before her like water before a stone, their expressions mixing sympathy with something that looked suspiciously like relief. Clara saw her first and felt her carefully constructed grief waver like candlelight in a draught. Aunt Velma's eyes were the same pale blue as their mother's had been, but sharper. Eyes that had learned to see past surfaces to the truths people buried underneath. "My poor girls," Velma whispered, opening her arms. But her embrace felt more like examination than comfort, her hands checking for injuries, her gaze cataloging details that others had missed. The sisters' fingernails, scrubbed clean, but still rimmed with something darker than dirt. The way Cora flinched when thunder rumbled overhead, not like someone traumatized by violence, but like someone remembering the weight of an axe in her hands. Blood calls to blood in ways that strangers never understand. Sheriff Bradley approached with his hat in his hands and questions heavy on his tongue. "Mrs. Patterson, these girls been through quite an ordeal. Found their menfolk murdered sometime in the night. Terrible business." Velma studied the sheriff's face, reading the careful neutrality that came from willful blindness. "Who would do such a thing?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Robbery, most likely. Strangers from outside the Hollow. Your brother-in-law kept us still, had money hidden away. Wrong kind of men must have come calling for their share." The lie hung between them like smoke, visible to anyone who cared to look, ignored by everyone who preferred not to see. Velma nodded slowly, playing her part in the community's unspoken agreement to let sleeping devils lie buried. But that night, when the neighbors had gone home and the sheriff had finished his cursory investigation, Velma sat with her nieces around the kitchen table and asked the questions that mattered. "Did they suffer?" she asked quietly. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "It happened fast, Aunt Velma. Too fast for much suffering." "And you girls? You weren't hurt?" Carrie shook her head, unable to meet her aunt's eyes. "We hid in the root cellar like Mama taught us, stayed quiet until morning." Velma reached across the table and took Cora's scarred hands in her own. The youngest sister had been silent since the sheriff left, staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering when doors creaked or floorboards groaned. "Cora, baby girl, look at me." When their eyes met, Velma saw something that confirmed her suspicions. Not the glazed shock of a victim, but the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd finally stopped fighting a war she'd been losing her entire life. From a letter Velma wrote to her husband that night, "The girls are safe now, Samuel. Safer than they've ever been. I pray God forgives them for what they've done, and I pray He forgives me for being glad they did it." The confession came in pieces over the following week. Not in words, the sisters were too smart for that, but in glances and silences, and the way they moved through the cabin like ghosts haunting their own lives. Clara was the strongest, maintaining the fiction, even when exhaustion made her hands shake, and sleepless nights carved dark circles under her eyes. She cooked and cleaned and received visitors with the appropriate mixture of grief and gratitude. But Velma noticed how she avoided the parlor where Silas had died, how she flinched when anyone mentioned the axes still missing from the woodshed. Carrie tried to disappear entirely, speaking only when spoken to, eating barely enough to keep a bird alive. She'd always been the most fragile of the three, the one who absorbed punishment like a sponge soaks water. Now she seemed to be fading away entirely, as if the act of killing had used up whatever strength she'd been hoarding for survival. But it was Cora who worried Velma most. The youngest sister had found something like peace in the aftermath of violence, but it was the peace of someone who'd stepped so far beyond normal human experience that she might never find her way back. On the fifth night, Velma found Cora standing in the yard at 2 a.m., staring up at the stars with an expression of serene emptiness. "Couldn't sleep?" Velma asked softly. "Don't need to anymore," Cora replied. "Used to dream about them every night. Daddy's hands, Uncle Ezra's breath, Uncle Jeb's voice, promising what he'd do to me when I got older. But they can't hurt me in dreams anymore, because they can't hurt me at all." The words hung in the mountain air like confession and benediction combined. "Cora, baby, I know what you're thinking, Aunt Velma. And you're right. We killed them. All three. Planned it for months. Waited for the perfect night. Made sure they'd never wake up to hurt anyone again." Velma pulled her niece close, feeling the tremors that ran through her thin frame like aftershocks from an earthquake. "I know, honey, I know." They stood together under stars that had witnessed 18 years of suffering and one night of terrible justice. Two women who understood that some secrets were too heavy for the law to carry, but too light for conscience to abandon. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A drifter had been found dead in Johnson County, shot through the chest with a rifle. In his pockets, investigators discovered jewelry that belonged to the Henderson family, murdered 3 weeks earlier, in a robbery that bore striking similarities to the McKinnon killings. Sheriff Bradley arrived at the cabin with something approaching enthusiasm for the first time since the investigation began. "Girls, we may have found our man." Fellow named Jake Morrison, known for violent robberies throughout East Tennessee, shot dead while resisting arrest, but he had evidence linking him to similar crimes. The sisters exchanged glances that lasted less than a heartbeat, but communicated volumes. Their carefully constructed alibi was about to receive official blessing from a coincidence too convenient to be anything but divine intervention. Some prayers get answered in ways that test faith more than they strengthen it. But even as the community prepared to close the book on the McKinnon murders, even as 3 young women prepared to inherit their tormentors' property and start fresh lives built on fresh graves, someone else was beginning to ask questions that had nothing to do with official investigations and everything to do with the kind of justice that operates outside the law. Could 3 teenagers really execute such a perfect crime? Or had they received help from someone who understood that some problems could only be solved with axes and alibis? The answer would come from an unexpected source, carrying consequences that would make the McKinnon murders seem like a gentle beginning to a much darker story. Ruby Morrison stood at her kitchen window, watching smoke rise from the McKinnon Hollow 3 miles down the ridge, and wondered if her husband's body was cold enough yet to stop the bleeding. The telegram had arrived that morning, informing her that Jake Morrison, drifter, robber, convenient scapegoat, had been shot dead while fleeing arrest. The only problem was that Jake Morrison had been in Ruby's root cellar for the past 2 weeks, waiting for his wounds to heal and his price to be paid. Ruby had been married to violence for 23 years, long enough to recognize its signature when she saw it carved into 3 young faces at her husband's funeral. The McKinnon sisters had attended the service for their supposed killer, standing in the back pew with expressions of gratitude that looked suspiciously like relief. But Ruby knew the difference between justice served and justice purchased, and she intended to collect what she was owed. The sound of horses' hooves on frozen ground announced visitors before they appeared through the morning mist. Ruby dried her hands on her apron and composed her face into the mask of grieving widowhood she'd been practicing in mirrors for years. When Sheriff Bradley knocked, she was ready with tears that fell on command and gratitude that rang hollow as a cracked bell. "Mrs. Morrison, I wanted to personally inform you about the resolution of your husband's case. The evidence we found links him conclusively to several violent robberies, including the McKinnon murders. You can take comfort knowing his crimes have been solved." Ruby nodded with appropriate solemnity, accepting the sheriff's condolences and his carefully edited version of events. But her eyes tracked past him to the 3 young women waiting in his wagon, supposedly brought along to see their tormentor's widow and find closure in her grief. Death makes strange partnerships. After the sheriff departed, Ruby invited the sisters inside for coffee and conversation. The cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with the careful poverty of a woman who'd learned to make nothing look like something. The sisters sat stiffly around her kitchen table, hands folded, eyes downcast, playing their roles with the dedication of actresses in a play where forgetting their lines meant death. "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said carefully, but grateful that justice was served. Ruby poured coffee with hands steady as stone. Justice is a peculiar thing. Sometimes it comes from judges and juries, sometimes from bullets in the dark, sometimes from axes in the night. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Carrie's cup rattled against her saucer. Cora went statue still, her breathing so shallow it barely moved her chest. Clara maintained eye contact, but Ruby caught the slight widening of her pupils that signaled either fear or calculation. In her experience, they amounted to the same thing. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning," Clara replied. Ruby smiled with all the warmth of January wind. "Of course you don't, dear. I'm just a grieving widow, prone to saying things that don't make sense. Like how strange it is that my husband supposedly robbed and murdered your family when he was here in my root cellar, recovering from a bullet wound he took in a poker game gone wrong 3 counties over." The silence that followed could have choked a horse. From Ruby Morrison's diary, found after her death in 1949, Jake was many things drunk, gambler, occasional thief, but he wasn't a killer. The McKinnon girls needed a dead man to blame, and I needed compensation for providing one. Some business arrangements benefit everyone involved. Ruby rose and walked to her kitchen window, gazing toward the hollow where 3 young women had learned that survival sometimes required becoming the monsters that hunted you. "Jake died 2 days after your family was killed, bled out from a gut wound that went septic. But his body stayed fresh in my cold cellar until the right price was offered." She turned back to face 3 pairs of eyes that now held the desperate calculation of cornered animals. Sheriff Bradley is a practical man who understands that some problems solve themselves if you provide the right evidence at the right time. A dead robber with jewelry from previous crimes makes everyone's life easier. The community gets closure, the law gets a solution, and 3 young women get their freedom. "What do you want?" Clara's voice had shed all pretense of grief, revealing the steel underneath. "What I've always wanted. Security. My husband left me nothing but debts and enemies. I'm 41 years old, in a place where women my age either remarry or starve. But the McKinnon property is worth something, and 3 grateful young women might be generous to the person who ensured their story stayed buried with the right corpse." The negotiation that followed was conducted in the language of survivors, direct, brutal, honest. Ruby laid out her terms with the precision of someone who'd spent years calculating the cost of silence. The sisters countered with the desperation of people who understood that freedom was never free, only bought with different currencies. They settled on a partnership that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. Ruby would receive 1/3 ownership of the McKinnon property and a monthly payment for her continued silence. The sisters would provide her with a home and security in exchange for her protection from anyone who might ask inconvenient questions about the convenient timing of her husband's death and discovery. But partnerships forged in blood carry their own risks. "There's one more thing," Ruby said as the sisters prepared to leave. "The Henderson family massacre 3 weeks ago, the jewelry found in Jake's pocket, that wasn't from any robbery he committed. I put it there after their real killers brought it to me, looking for the same arrangement you're making now." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to spread beyond anyone's ability to control it. Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. I'm saying you girls aren't the only ones who discovered that some problems require permanent solutions. There are others out there, other families who reached their breaking point and took matters into their own hands. And they all know about my services." The McKinnon sisters had thought they were alone in their darkness, unique in their choice to solve violence with violence. But Ruby Morrison's smile suggested they'd stumbled into something much larger, a network of people who'd learned that justice was a commodity that could be bought, sold, and carefully managed by those who understood its true value. "How many others?" Cora whispered. Ruby's smile widened. "Enough to keep us all very busy and very quiet for a very long time. Some secrets are too small to matter and too large to keep, but some secrets are just the right size to build empires on, if you know the right people and aren't squeamish about the foundation they're built upon." The sisters had killed for freedom and found themselves bound to something darker than slavery, a conspiracy that stretched across East Tennessee like a spider's web, connecting families who'd made the same choice and needed the same protection. They were about to discover that their 3 axes had carved a path into a world where justice wore many faces, but none of them were kind. The meeting took place in Widow Crawley's barn on a November night, when frost made the world look clean despite the blood underneath. 7 women sat in a circle around a kerosene lantern, their faces carved from shadows and shared secrets. This was the moment when the McKinnon sisters learned they'd joined something that had been growing in the Tennessee mountains for decades, a sisterhood bound not by blood, but by the necessity of permanent solutions to permanent problems. Ruby Morrison served as conductor for this orchestra of violence, her voice steady as she called the gathering to order. "Ladies, we have new members tonight. The McKinnon sisters have proven they understand our particular brand of problem solving." The other women studied Clara, Carrie, and Cora with expressions that mixed sympathy with calculation. Each face told a story carved in scars visible and hidden. Each pair of eyes held memories of choices that couldn't be undone and wouldn't be regretted. Martha Henderson, whose husband and sons had died in their sleep 3 weeks before the McKinnon murders, nodded approvingly. "Heard you used axes. Quick work. My boys lasted longer than they should have. Screaming brings neighbors." Beside her sat Eleanor Pike, who'd lost her voice to her husband's hands but found her power in rat poison mixed with Sunday gravy. Next to Eleanor, the widow Crawley herself, hostess to murderers and grandmother to 7 children who would never know what really happened to their grandfather's drinking companions. The circle continued around the barn like a rosary of retribution. Women aged 16 to 60, united by the understanding that some men couldn't be reformed, only removed. Silence stretched like spider silk until Ruby spoke again. From the Kingsport Times, November 3, 1926. Authorities report a disturbing trend of unexplained deaths among male family members throughout East Tennessee. Investigation hampered by lack of witnesses and overwhelming community support for grieving families. "The arrangement is simple," Ruby explained to the newest members. "We provide alibis, evidence disposal, and body management. You provide payment and absolute silence. Anyone who breaks the circle threatens everyone in it." Clara found her voice first. Always the strategist, even in this gathering of strategists. "How long has this been operating?" 15 years, give or take. Started when my predecessor, God rest her practical soul, helped 3 farm wives stage their husband's hunting accident. Word spreads, careful-like among women, who understand that some problems can't be solved by law or prayer. The economics were brutal and simple. Each family paid according to their means, cash when possible, property when necessary, labor when money was scarce. Ruby maintained the network through careful record-keeping and strategic silence, ensuring that law enforcement found patterns that pointed anywhere but toward organized resistance. The key, she continued, is variety. Accidents, illnesses, robberies gone wrong, random violence by drifters. No two deaths can look the same, or someone starts asking questions we can't answer. Carrie shifted uncomfortably on her hay bale seat. What if someone talks? What if the guilt becomes too much? The temperature in the barn dropped 10 degrees, and every woman turned to study the middle McKinnon sister with expressions that suggested she'd asked a dangerous question. Eleanor Pike pulled out a small notebook and wrote in careful script, "Guilt is a luxury we can't afford. Anyone who endangers the group endangers their own children, their own freedom, their own lives." She showed the note to Carrie, then struck a match and watched it burn. The message was clear, as mountain spring water and twice as cold. Ruby stood and walked to a corner of the barn where feed sacks concealed something that made the air thick with metallic possibility. She pulled back the canvas to reveal a collection that would have impressed a professional assassin. Knives of various sizes, bottles containing substances that could mimic natural death, tools that could stage accidents, convincing enough to fool coroners who preferred simple explanations. "We share resources," she said, running her finger along a blade sharp enough to split hairs. "Knowledge, experience, protection. But most importantly, we share consequences. If one falls, we all hang together, literally. The newest revolution always thinks it invented the wheel." Clara studied the faces around the circle, recognizing something she'd never seen before: women who'd stopped apologizing for their own survival. "How many families have you helped?" 47 successful operations over 15 years. Not a single arrest, not a single conviction. Law enforcement gets their solved cases, communities get their peace, and families get their freedom. Martha Henderson leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd outlived her tormentors. "The trick is patience. We spent 2 years planning my family's accident, waiting for the right storm, the right witnesses, the right moment when 3 men could disappear into a flooded creek without raising suspicions." "And the bodies?" Cora asked, speaking for the first time since entering the barn. "What bodies?" Martha smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned that rivers keep secrets better than graves. "Amazing how many men get drunk and fall into fast water during spring floods. Amazing how many hunting accidents happen when visibility is poor. Amazing how many sudden illnesses strike households where the women have learned to cook with. Creativity." The meeting continued past midnight, each woman sharing methods, successes, and the occasional failure that had required creative cleanup. They spoke in the technical language of people who turned murder into craftsmanship, discussing dosages and timing with the precision of pharmacists, reviewing alibis with the thoroughness of lawyers. But underneath the practical discussion ran a current of something deeper: the recognition that they'd crossed a line that separated them forever from the women they'd been before. They were bound together by shared guilt and mutual protection, a sisterhood forged in blood that couldn't be dissolved by confession or regret. As the gathering broke up, Ruby pulled the McKinnon sisters aside for final instructions. "Your first assignment comes next month. The Gentry family down in Johnson County needs our services. Father's been beating his wife and daughters for 20 years, getting worse since he lost his job at the mill." "We don't know them," Clara protested. "You don't need to. You know the type, you know the problem, and now you know the solution. The Gentry women will pay our fee, and you'll provide the technical assistance. Consider it your graduation exercise." The sisters walked home through frost that crunched under their feet like broken promises. Behind them, the barn returned to innocent darkness, hiding evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across 3 counties and countless graves. They'd thought killing their tormentors would end their story, but they discovered instead that it was only the prologue to something much larger and more dangerous. Could 3 teenagers who'd barely survived their own family's violence really serve as instruments of death for strangers? Or would their first assignment outside Boone Hollow prove that some lines, once crossed, lead only to darker territories where retreat becomes impossible? The answer would come with December's snow, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the weight of choices that would define the rest of their shortened lives. The scream that split the December air wasn't supposed to happen until after midnight, but Emma Gentry's 5-year-old son had woken early and wandered into the kitchen just as his mother brought the cleaver down on his father's neck. The boy's cry of, "Mama, no," would haunt 3 counties for decades to come. This was the moment when the McKinnon sisters learned that murder, like any other skill, required practice to perfect, and that some mistakes couldn't be buried deep enough to stop them from clawing back to the surface. The Gentry farmhouse sat in a valley where morning fog never quite lifted, where the smell of wood rot and desperation clung to everything like a second skin. Thomas Gentry had beaten his wife Emma unconscious the night before for burning his cornbread, then passed out drunk in his chair by the kitchen fire. The plan was simple. Emma would stage a home invasion while her children slept upstairs, using the cleaver to ensure Thomas never woke to hurt anyone again. But children don't sleep on schedule, and 5-year-old Billy Gentry had chosen the worst possible moment to seek comfort from his mother. Clara pressed her back against the kitchen wall, watching Emma Gentry collapse over her husband's body while her son stood frozen in the doorway, his small face painted with blood that steamed in the cold December air. Carrie had grabbed the boy, clamping a hand over his mouth to stop the screaming, but the damage was done. They had a witness who was too young to understand conspiracy and too innocent to keep secrets. The weight of shared guilt makes strange allies. "We have to do something," Emma whispered, her voice hollow as wind through empty barns. "He saw everything. He'll tell someone. They'll hang us all." Cora knelt beside the trembling child, her scarred hands surprisingly gentle as she wiped blood from his cheeks. "Billy, honey, look at me. What did you see in here?" The boy's eyes were wide as silver dollars, reflecting lamplight and terrible understanding. "Mama hurt Daddy. There's red everywhere. Why is there so much red?" From the Johnson County Coroner's Report, December 15, 1926, Thomas Gentry, age 34, died from massive trauma to the neck region. Evidence suggests home invasion. Investigation ongoing. The official record would never mention a 5-year-old witness or the choice 3 teenage sisters made in a kitchen that smelled of death and desperation. Some decisions happen in the space between heartbeats, too fast for conscience to interfere, too permanent for regret to change. Clara looked at Carrie, who looked at Cora, who looked at Emma Gentry cradling her dead husband's head in her lap. Without words, they reached the same terrible conclusion Billy Gentry had seen too much and understood too little to be allowed to carry his testimony beyond this kitchen. "There was an accident," Clara said finally, her voice steady as creek stones. "Billy fell and hit his head when he saw what the bad men did to his daddy. Tragic thing, losing a father and son the same night." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Emma's sobs sounded like something tearing inside her chest. "I can't. He's my baby. My little boy." "Then we all hang," Carrie said quietly. "Him, you, us. Everyone who trusted us to keep this secret. Everyone who's counting on us to protect them." The mathematics of survival had never been simple, but they'd never been this brutal. Cora was the one who acted, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to disconnect action from emotion. One moment Billy Gentry was crying for his mama. The next, he was silent as the snow beginning to fall outside the kitchen windows. Some lines, once crossed, make all previous lines seem like suggestions. They staged the scene with the expertise of people who'd learned that details matter when lives hang in the balance. Father and son, victims of the same home invasion. Emma, traumatized widow who'd hidden upstairs while strangers murdered her family. The McKinnon sisters, neighbors who'd arrived to help and found only tragedy. But killing a child changes something in the killers that killing adults never touches. As they worked through the night, arranging bodies and planting evidence, each woman felt a piece of herself die that couldn't be buried with the victims. The investigation was thorough, but yielded the expected results. Sheriff Bradley found evidence of forced entry, signs of robbery, and a grieving mother whose testimony painted a picture of random violence by unknown assailants. The community rallied around Emma Gentry with the same mixture of sympathy and relief they'd shown the McKinnon sisters. Another problem solved, another family freed from violence. But solutions built on murdered children carry their own poison. Emma Gentry never recovered from that December night. She moved in with her sister's family, spoke rarely, ate less, and spent her days staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Within 6 months, she'd wasted away to nothing, dying of what the doctor called grief, but what everyone who knew her recognized as something much more corrosive. The McKinnon sisters returned to Boone Hollow, changed in ways that went deeper than guilt. Clara began drinking her father's leftover moonshine, seeking oblivion in the same bottles that had once fueled his rages. Carrie stopped speaking entirely except when absolutely necessary, communicating in nods and silences that said more than words ever could. Cora took to wandering the mountains at night, talking to ghosts only she could see. But the network Ruby Morrison had built didn't pause for individual breakdowns or collective guilt. More families needed help, more problems required permanent solutions, and the Sisterhood of Necessary Evils continued its work with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for one purpose. From a letter found among Ruby Morrison's papers, the Gentry job went sideways, but these things happen in our line of work. The girls will recover, or they won't. Either way, the work continues. 3 months after Billy Gentry's death, another assignment arrived. The Caldwell family in Washington County needed assistance with a patriarch who'd begun molesting his granddaughters. The fee was substantial, the target deserving, the method left to their discretion. But the McKinnon sisters had learned that some prices are too high to pay, even for justice. When they looked at the Caldwell assignment, they saw not another deserving victim, but another family with children who might witness what they shouldn't, might carry secrets too heavy for small shoulders. "We're done," Clara announced at the next meeting in Widow Crawley's barn. "Find someone else for your dirty work." Ruby Morrison's smile was sharp as winter wind. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, dear. You see, we're all in this together now. Forever." The trap had been closing around them for months, built from shared secrets and mutual guilt, tightened by the knowledge that any one of them could destroy all the others with a single confession. They'd thought they were joining a sisterhood, but they'd discovered instead that they'd signed a contract written in blood and sealed with the death of innocence, a contract that could only be terminated by death itself. Could 3 young women who'd killed for freedom find a way to escape the very network that had protected them? Or were they bound forever to Ruby Morrison's empire of necessary evils? The answer would come with spring's thaw, carrying consequences that would make Billy Gentry's death seem like a gentle introduction to the true cost of organized justice. The fire started at Ruby Morrison's cabin on March 21, 1927, spreading faster than wildfire through dry timber, consuming evidence and witnesses with equal hunger. By dawn, nothing remained but ash and the charred skeleton of a woman who'd built an empire on other people's secrets. This was the moment when the McKinnon sisters learned that some chains can only be broken by burning everything they're attached to, including the people who forged them. The blaze had been visible for miles, orange flames clawing at the night sky like desperate fingers reaching for heaven or hell. By the time neighbors arrived with buckets and good intentions, Ruby Morrison was already beyond saving. Her body twisted in the doorway as if she'd been trying to escape something that moved faster than fear. Clara stood among the crowd of onlookers, her face painted with firelight and careful concern, playing the role of shocked neighbor while ash fell like snow around them. Inside her coat pocket, her fingers wrapped around the empty kerosene can she'd hidden there, still smelling of the fuel that had turned Ruby's cabin into a crematorium. The official cause would be listed as accidental, a kerosene lamp knocked over during sleep, a tragedy that claimed another mountain widow. But 3 women in the crowd knew better, and their silence was bought with the understanding that they'd all burn their bridges the same night they'd burned their blackmailer. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too valuable to sell. Sheriff Bradley arrived as the last flames gutted what remained of Ruby's kitchen, the same room where she'd stored her carefully cataloged records of 47 successful murders and the families who'd paid for them. Every ledger, every photograph, every piece of evidence that could connect the network of necessary evils to its victims, all reduced to carbon and memory. Terrible loss, the sheriff murmured, but his tone suggested he was calculating how many unsolved cases would remain permanently unsolved now that Ruby Morrison's filing system had gone up in smoke. From his private notes, fire destroyed what investigation couldn't touch. Sometimes Providence works in mysterious ways. The other women in Ruby's network understood what had happened without needing explanation. Martha Henderson, Eleanor Pike, Widow Crawley, and the rest. They recognized the scent of revolution in the ash-heavy air. The McKinnon sisters had done what none of them had dared attempt. They'd killed the person who owned their secrets. But freedom purchased with murder carries its own mortgage. Within a week, the network began to dissolve like sugar in rain. Women who depended on Ruby's protection suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Their carefully constructed alibis and staged evidence no longer backed by professional expertise. Some fled Tennessee entirely, disappearing into distant states where their reputations couldn't follow. Others doubled down on isolation, retreating so far into mountain hollows that they became legends rather than neighbors. Martha Henderson hanged herself from her own porch rafters on April 2nd. The note she left blamed grief over her family's deaths, but everyone who knew her understood. She was mourning the loss of something else entirely, the security that came from shared guilt and mutual protection. Eleanor Pike vanished entirely, leaving behind only a cabin full of furniture and a well-tended garden that bloomed unattended through the spring. Some said she'd returned to family in North Carolina. Others whispered she'd joined the bodies buried in various locations throughout East Tennessee, another casualty of a war that left no official records. The dissolution wasn't peaceful. Widow Crawley attempted to rebuild the network under her own leadership, but she lacked Ruby's organizational skills and strategic thinking. Her first attempt at evidence disposal ended with a body floating to the surface of what was supposed to be a permanent grave, leading to questions that she couldn't answer without implicating herself. She died in her sleep 3 months later, officially from heart failure, but neighbors reported seeing 3 young women leaving her property in the hours before dawn on the day her body was discovered. The mathematics of survival had simplified to a single equation: kill or be killed, trust no one, leave no witnesses. The McKinnon sisters returned to their hollow as the only survivors of a conspiracy that had once stretched across 3 counties. They were free in ways they'd never imagined possible. No blackmailers, no network obligations, no assignments that required them to murder strangers' children in strangers' kitchens. But freedom built on burned bridges offers no path back to innocence. Clara began having conversations with people who weren't there, responding to questions only she could hear, laughing at jokes that existed only in the space between memory and madness. Carrie stopped eating regularly, her body shrinking, until she looked like a scarecrow dressed in human clothes. Cora took to sitting in the cemetery, talking to headstones as if they were old friends who understood the weight of secrets too heavy for the living to carry. They'd survived their father, their uncles, Ruby Morrison, and the network of necessary evils. But they couldn't survive what they'd become in the process of surviving everything else. From a letter Clara wrote, but never sent, found after her death. "We thought killing them would set us free, but we just traded one prison for another. The bars are made of memory now, and the guards are the ghosts of everyone who died, so we could live." The end came on October 15th, 1927. Exactly 1 year after the night they'd first raised their axes against the men who'd made their lives unbearable. It came not from law enforcement, or vengeful relatives, or surviving members of Ruby Morrison's network, but from the simple understanding that some stories have only one possible conclusion. They met in the kitchen, where everything had started. Three sisters who'd shared the same womb, the same childhood, the same trauma, and the same descent into necessary evil. The discussion was brief, practical, final, the same tone they'd used when planning their first murders and their last. Clara had prepared the tea with the same care she'd once used to sharpen axes, measuring doses with the precision Ruby Morrison had taught her network. Carrie had written the note explaining their decision, her handwriting still steady despite everything her hands had done. Cora had chosen the timing sunset, when the mountain fog would hide what needed to be hidden until it was too late for rescue. They drank their tea while watching the sun disappear behind ridges that had witnessed 4 generations of McKinnon violence. The poison worked quickly, more merciful than axes, more final than fire. By full dark, Boone Hollow was silent for the second time in a year, but this silence would be permanent. Some chains can only be broken by the people who wear them, and some prisons can only be escaped by those willing to surrender the keys along with their lives. Could 3 young women who'd killed for freedom finally find peace in death? Or would their story continue to echo through the Tennessee mountains long after their voices had been stilled forever? The answer would come with morning light and the discovery that would turn the McKinnon sisters from local legends into cautionary tales that mothers would whisper to daughters for generations yet to come. The postman found them 3 days later, sitting around their kitchen table like they were waiting for supper that would never come. 3 teacups, 3 notes written in identical handwriting, 3 sisters who'd chosen their ending with the same precision they'd used to plan their beginning. This was the moment when Clara, Carrie, and Cora McKinnon transformed from killers into martyrs, from criminals into cautionary tales that would outlive the mountains themselves. Deputy Marshal Franklin arrived from Johnson City to investigate what the local papers would call the Boone Hollow tragedy. But he found a scene that defied simple categorization. The sisters had arranged themselves with deliberate care. Clara facing the door where her father used to enter drunk and violent, Carrie positioned toward the window where she'd watched for Uncle Jeb's approach, Cora staring at the corner where Uncle Ezra had cornered her too many times to count. Even in death, they were still fighting their ghosts. The notes they'd left were brief, identical, unsigned. "We done what needed doing. Now we done what needs doing. Don't mourn us. We been dead since we was children." This is just making it official. The handwriting analysis would later confirm what everyone suspected: all 3 notes written by the same person, though no expert could determine which sister had served as scribe for their collective suicide pact. From the Carter County Examiner, October 20th, 1927, poison deaths of McKinnon sisters remain mysterious. Circumstances suggest coordinated suicide following anniversary of family murders. No criminal charges expected. The aftermath revealed secrets that had been buried deeper than bodies. In a hidden compartment beneath their kitchen floorboards, investigators discovered Ruby Morrison's missing record books, complete with names, dates, and detailed accounts of 47 murders across 3 counties. The ledgers read like a business manual for organized revenge, methodically cataloging the elimination of violent men by the women they'd terrorized. But the most disturbing discovery came in Cora's bedroom, where deputies found a collection of children's clothes carefully preserved in a cedar chest. Tiny shoes, small dresses, a cloth doll with button eyes, belongings that had never belonged to the McKinnon sisters, who'd been the only children in their household. The clothes matched descriptions of items missing from crime scenes throughout East Tennessee, souvenirs taken from families who'd paid the ultimate price for the sisters' education in necessary evil. Billy Gentry's favorite shirt, a hair ribbon belonging to the youngest Henderson girl, who'd supposedly died in the hunting accident with her father and brothers. Small reminders of the children who'd witnessed what they shouldn't have seen, who'd carried secrets too dangerous for their small shoulders. Some trophies commemorate victories that can't be celebrated. The revelation transformed public perception of the McKinnon sisters from tragic heroines into something much more complex and disturbing. They'd been victims who became victimizers, survivors who'd learned to survive by ensuring others didn't. Their story spread beyond East Tennessee, carried by newspapers and radio broadcasts to cities where such violence seemed impossible, but where people understood the desperation that could drive the powerless to seize power through any means necessary. The community's response split along lines that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with conscience. Some viewed the sisters as martyrs who died to protect other families from the network they'd helped create. Others saw them as monsters who'd corrupted justice into something unrecognizable, using legitimate grievances to justify inexcusable crimes. Sheriff Bradley retired 2 months after the McKinnon investigation closed, moving to Florida, where he spent his remaining years refusing to discuss the cases that had defined his career. His replacement found a county transformed by the knowledge that violence could be organized, systematized, and hidden behind the facade of grief and community support. The trials began the following spring, as surviving members of Ruby Morrison's network were identified and prosecuted. Martha Henderson's sister confessed to helping stage the hunting accident. Eleanor Pike was found living under an assumed name in Kentucky and extradited to face murder charges. One by one, the women who'd thought their secrets died with Ruby Morrison discovered that some evidence survives even the most thorough fires. But the McKinnon sisters escaped earthly justice through the simple expedient of being dead. Their crimes preserved in ledgers that read like historical documents rather than criminal confessions. From the final entry in Ruby Morrison's records, the McKinnon girls show promise but lack discipline. Their success has made them overconfident, may require permanent retirement if they become liability to organization. The prophecy had proven accurate, though not in ways Ruby could have anticipated. The Boone Hollow property was sold at auction to satisfy debts the sisters had accumulated during their brief criminal career. The cabin, where 4 generations of McKinnon violence had played out, was demolished, its timber scattered, its foundations left to disappear beneath mountain laurel and wild grapevines. But demolition can't destroy legends, and the story of Clara, Carrie, and Cora McKinnon took root in mountain soil like kudzu, growing stronger with each telling, spreading beyond the boundaries of fact into the realm of folklore, where truth matters less than meaning. Local mothers began using the McKinnon tale as a warning to daughters who complained about controlling fathers or demanding husbands. "Remember the Boone Hollow sisters," they'd whisper. "Remember what happens when good girls decide they've had enough." The message was complex, contradictory, impossible to decode. Don't let men break you, but don't break them either. Fight back, but not too hard. Survive, but don't become the thing that nearly killed you. Some lessons are too dangerous to teach and too important to ignore. Years passed. The McKinnon murders became local legend, then regional folklore, then the subject of ballads sung in places where mountain music carried memories too heavy for ordinary conversation. The sisters' story evolved with each telling, growing larger and darker until it encompassed not just their crimes, but their entire community's complicity in violence that everyone knew about and no one had stopped. By the 1950s, tour guides in East Tennessee were directing visitors to the site where Boone Hollow used to exist, spinning tales of three sisters who'd taken justice into their own hands and paid the ultimate price for their choices. The stories grew more elaborate, with each telling ghost sightings, mysterious fires, axes found buried in unlikely places. But the tourists always left before sunset, unwilling to spend darkness in a place where the boundary between justice and murder had been erased by three young women who'd learned that some problems have only permanent solutions. Even today, when October fog rolls through the Tennessee mountains, old-timers claim they can still hear the sound of axes cutting through more than wood, still smell the metallic scent of blood mixed with mountain air, still see three figures moving through the mist with the purposeful stride of people who finally found their power and refused to surrender it. The McKinnon sisters had wanted freedom from violence, but they discovered instead that violence was the only currency their world recognized. And once you learn that language, you can never stop speaking it, even when it's the last words you'll ever say. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.